Thank you for joining Pluralist Points. Today we have Professor Corey Brettschneider. He's a professor of political science at Brown University, where he teaches constitutional law and political theory. He is the editor of the series Penguin Liberty and the author of numerous articles in top political science journals and law reviews, including the American Political Science Review, Political Theory, and the Texas Law Review. His constitutional law casebook is widely used in classrooms throughout the United States. Some of the books he's written include When the State Speaks, What Should It Say? How Democracies Can Protect Expression and Promote Equality. His other book is called Democratic Rights, The Substance of Self-Government. And The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It, which is the subject of our conversation today. Thank you for joining us, Corey.
Thanks so much for the invite, Ben, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Now, one of the things I notice you highlighting in the book is the idea that this democracy is fragile. Is it fragile or resilient, or both? I mean, I hear both things from time to time from scholars, thinkers, and thought leaders who are trying to encourage us to do the hard work, to sort of work to preserve it and not take it for granted. But I've often wrestled with the question, sort of, how fragile is it? Or is it, what is the level of resilience of our democracy? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, certainly it is fragile. That's part of the point of the book, that there is a warning really at the founding from Patrick Henry. And of course, Patrick Henry, as listeners will know, is a revolutionary hero, but he also opposed ratification of the Constitution, and he opposed ratification because of the fragility of what he thought this new constitutional system would bring, and specifically had a particular vulnerable point that he was worried about its fragility, and that was the American presidency. And his argument is that this office is so powerful that it assumes a good person in office. But if you get a bad person, a criminal president, and a criminal president, not just in the sense of criminally minded in a sort of petty criminal way, but like one who's got grand ambitions for their crimes, they're going to realize that the traditional checks on the office, the judiciary, impeachment, that those don't work. The formal checks, maybe, would be a way to put it. And actually, they're going to, now this is the part that I think to many sounded paranoid at the time and might have seemed paranoid until somewhat recently, that they are going to realize that without the checks, that they can aggrandize power so much so that they might even, and this is the wild part, crown themselves a monarch. Now, that's his warning against ratification. And what I want to say is American democracy has certainly survived. It hasn't collapsed. But we've had moments where any recognizable sense of it was at risk. And it was at risk for Henry's reason. The American presidency has always been a danger, and we've seen it. I talk about 5 previous times in American history where there was a real vulnerability to its collapse from presidents who threatened it. Now, you ask, about survival. I don't think I'd use the term resilience, because I'm always worried about the idea that somehow the Constitution is self-correcting, or that it's such a genius document that the intended checks, impeachment and the judiciary, for instance, are definitely going to work. Instead, I think what's happened is that at these moments of crisis, that the recovery has come through a combination that the framers really didn't anticipate. And that's both citizens forming what I call constitutional constituencies, looking to save a democratic idea of the Constitution, and in a particular way, partly by voicing these ideas in ways that America will come to understand, but then channeling the energy behind these ideas, this democratic recovery idea, by electing subsequent presidents. So the thing that makes us vulnerable is the American presidency. The thing that's allowed us to recover is also the American presidency, not acting on its own, but at the behest of these democratic constitutional constituencies. That's the argument of the book. Now, part of what I want to say is definitely this should give us hope in the ability of American democracy to survive, but it also shows its vulnerability at the same time. And so there's a sort of grade school traditional way we talk about checks and balances. And I want to say those checks and balances really are not the thing that's worked to save us at the most dire times. It's these citizens acting. And It's partly about agency, that we shouldn't assume a kind of mechanism that's automatically going to save us. There's no constitution police. So what is there? There are citizens who really can take matters into their own hands to save democracy.
Right. Do you think that the founders were thinking too much about, George Washington sort of as a model,
Yeah.
because of the kind of character that, he had when they were thinking about the president, that sort of overshadowed their thinking?
Absolutely. I mean, you took the words out of my mouth. They watched him preside over the convention. They respected him. And he says, I mean, to my mind, he gives one of the most ideal understandings of the American presidency when he says, at the founding, look, I've just taken the oath of office as in a second inaugural. And I just took the oath of office. And if I violate it, I want the people assembled here to call me on it by criticizing me, upbraiding me. And if I really mess it up, this is he says this in a much pithier way than I am, actually, shortest in American history. He says, if I really mess up, I want you to subject me to constitutional punishment. So, I mean, think of the kind of person that would do that, right? They really see the office as an office subject to the Constitution and the rule of law, and subject to criticism. And yet he's replaced, the second president is very different than Washington by, as you know from the book, by John Adams, who really has a totally different understanding of the office, a kind of quasi-monarch, not subject to criticism. And in fact, he tries to enforce his idea of the presidency with the Sedition Act.
Yeah, which is a great segue, because that was going to be my next question about sort of Washington and Adams coming back to back. And, these people have such different personalities. Adams has this sort of royal envy, and the idea that, the president might be called His Highness, I think super, very, very, very strange, and sought to enlarge his powers. What accounts this difference? And maybe it's obvious. Maybe it's just a matter of, personalities. The kinds of people who seek that kind of office might be prone to certain, kinds of personalities, and Washington didn't necessarily have it. Although maybe he had it, but exhibited in different ways. I think we mentioned in the book that he was a really wealthy businessman, and he focused on those things rather than, enlarging his powers as president. Is this simply sort of just personality differences?
I mean, it's part of it, definitely, that Washington really had this kind of modesty that reassured people, I think, when they were crafting the office itself. And that's a lot of why they were a little naive, I think, in the way that they thought of a president. And Adams is not really like that. He's thin-skinned. When his son is criticized, when he's criticized, he feels it, and that's part of the idea of the Sedition Act. But it's more than that. Adams looks down on Washington because he's got a sort of folksy, common sense way of thinking. He's not a scholar. Adams is a political theorist, a constitutional lawyer, one of the premier thinkers about these issues, that we all teach and write about of his time. But yet, in the content of the way he thinks about it, it's really not, I wouldn't call him a democratic thinker. He doesn't think of we the people as the sovereign entity to which all the branches are subject. That's not the way he thinks about things. And Eric Nelson and others who have really written about his royalism, and Gordon Wood also, I mean, there's sort of consensus, I think, about Adams, although disagreement about how widely spread these ideas were at the time. But he has a philosophical idea of the president as a kind of quasi-monarch, justified by reference to Montesquieu in terms of the stability that this office will bring, as opposed to the House, which really is grounded in the will of the people. And so when it comes to sedition, he says what a lot of Federalists said at the time, which is that the Sedition Act is consistent with the common law. There's some free speech, but not a right to criticize the monarch. And so in the same way, by analogy, it's not a right to criticize the president. And there is a widespread belief at the time that when the Sedition Act is introduced, even though it really does shut down criticism of the president, by the way, it's tailored to allow criticism of the vice president, a member of a different party, Thomas Jefferson, very partisan attack on opponents. But it's seen as constitutional because it's not prior restraint, it's punishment after the fact. And, that's seen as consistent with the common law. And so I mean, part of, I wish I could say like, okay, it was just these thin-skinned presidents who threatened democracy because of their personalities. No, there are deep ideas of what I call an authoritarian idea of the Constitution that are behind them. And Adams, the first threat to democracy that I talk about, really has that in depth. And, he'd be sitting here defending his view against me. It's not that it's
Hmm.
not thought out,
Hmm.
but it is partly dangerous because it's so thought out.
Yeah. Now, so Adams helps to establish the Sedition Act. Um, is there anything more egregious in terms of silencing dissent than the Sedition Act?
I think it's the use of it. It's partly, you see, its offensiveness, its threat to democracy and its content. As I said, it's gerrymandered really to go after the opposition party. And you see that
Mhm.
in the fact that there's no punishment for criticizing the vice president, or there is for criticizing the president. And then the way it's used is, I think sometimes scholars at one point were writing about it as if it was seldom used, but it's over about, as many as 126 prosecutions. And when you start looking into them, they're pretty egregious. They include Matthew Leone, a sitting congressman from Vermont, who's prosecuted largely for stuff that he says on the floor of the House, and the main opposition editors who are really criticizing Adams and his policies. One of the worst things about it is what gets it off the ground is that there was a report of a plot to usurp the election of 1800 by the Federalists. And it sounds eerily familiar because the way the plot worked was there was going to be a committee to deny the certification of electoral votes. And under the Constitution, of course, if you can't get to the threshold required by the Electoral College, it throws it to the House. And the Federalists thought they could win in the House. Anyway, when this plot it's not really a secret plot because it's discussed on the floor of the House. When it's published by one of the editors, that freaks out the Federalist Party, and the act is partly in retaliation for that. There's a personal element as well. I talk about Abigail Adams corresponding with her husband, John Adams, about the fact that their son is being subject to attacks, and that seems to have touched a nerve for both of them. So it's a variety of elements. It's pure politics, really trying to undermine democracy in the most raw sense through this plot to usurp the election and retaliation for uncovering it. It's thin-skinnedness, as we started out talking about. And then, to my mind, again, the most dangerous thing is the philosophical, authoritarian idea of the Constitution. And by the way, it's not that they didn't know, of course, that the First Amendment had been passed. There was a right to free speech under the First Amendment, but they thought you read it consistent with the common law. And it allows for the prosecution of criticism of the president of sedition.
Yeah, the entire story is really fascinating. Now, in the book you outlined this sort of cycling of crisis or chaos and recovery.
Right.
Um, uh, I wonder, so is this like an inevitable aspect of democracy?
No,
Uh,
I don't think so. I think, this goes back to our first exchange. I think
mhm.
I wish that would be great if I could say, don't worry, everybody, it's guaranteed to work. No, it's not a formal mechanism. It doesn't operate in the way the framers thought impeachment, for instance. I mean, they thought, look, impeachment, if somebody commits not just a crime, but a high crime and misdemeanor, an act so grave that it's an abuse of power that really threatens the whole system, then everybody's going to come together and the majority will vote in the House, 2/3 of the Senate. And, we don't want it to be partisan, so that 2/3 will protect us. And then there'll be a disqualification vote. End of story. And of course, that's never fully played out. I mean, maybe the Nixon case, we can talk about it. It played a role, but nobody has ever been removed from office and disqualified in the history of the United States, despite these moments where it should have been used in my view. But and what has worked are the citizen actions, constitutional constituencies coming together to elect recovery presidents. But what I'm trying to emphasize throughout the book is like it really rested on these people in interviews have been calling them constitutional heroes. I like that. I don't use that phrase, but it's agents who really rose above the moment and did something heroic. We haven't gotten to Frederick Douglass. He is really chief among them, but the editors certainly are among them. And what they did that was pretty extraordinary is in this moment of crisis where they're facing their own prosecutions, they used their trials to try to defend the idea that the First Amendment right to free speech is a right to dissent. And they used their trials to try to put Adams on trial and to say this is an authoritarian president. They're really recovering and claiming the democratic idea of not just free speech, but that what that means is a right to criticize the president. We're so used to Saturday Night Live, and this is part of our culture, that of course you can criticize the president, and they're really creating it at the moment. But was that inevitable that it played out that way? No, I mean, probably if you had to bet at the time, Adams looked pretty strong. And again, Adams, and this is true of many of the presidents in the book, Wilson certainly, there's an authority to him, and still when he's talked about, think of McCullough, and we revere him for his learnedness. And I'm not going to deny that he's learned. I mean, I don't know. That's a little over. As a political theorist, I went and read a lot of the work. It's a little meandering, and it's like a pretty good dissertation. But is it great? Not in the way that people have claimed, because it really is an assault on democracy.
Yeah,
but it's dangerous for that reason.
Right. And I guess the thing that's also interesting, I mean, you cover presidents that kind of cut across the labels, right? The political labels. Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat, Nixon is a Republican. Right. So it's these are things that can come. They're characters that, regardless of what party the president can exhibit, which is not good.
Right.
And in moments of national crisis, the president's role becomes even more pivotal. What are the qualities of presidential leadership that have historically led to successful navigation through crises? But I guess, these recovery presidents, I guess, right. What are the core features that truly make them, recovery presidents?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the features aren't exactly inverse, but many of them are. One is kind of responsiveness to the constituency. And even though that sometimes, might be seen as pandering, but there has to be a kind of openness. So was Jefferson in his heart a true defender of free speech? I'm not sure, but he's elected on this idea of letting the Sedition Act expire and not return. And so when he says we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, he's really celebrating the editor's idea that we're not going to prosecute dissent in this country. But he secretly has a lot of the flaws of, the worst presidents, and privately seeks prosecutions, for instance, of his opponents. But at least the idea is recovered. In Madison, you really get somebody who I think of in many ways in the tradition of Washington, that he's restrained, he's modest, and even during the War of 1812, this is the great triumph in the early republic for free speech. He has this chance, this actual war, as opposed to a kind of quasi-war in Adams' time. And he could say, okay, this is different, real war, we're going to shut down dissent. And he doesn't. He listens to the opposition party, a newspaper editor named Hanson in particular, who's facing, attacks on his life, and refuses to institute a new Sedition Act. In some ways, it's that there's a kind of more folk morality with some of these recovery presidents, as I call them, and thanks for using my term too for listeners. The as opposed to this sort of grandiose vision of the Constitution. So I'm thinking of Truman in particular in the last cluster, as you mentioned. Woodrow Wilson really brings about a kind of new crisis of democracy by nationalizing white supremacy and trying to nationalize it, and succeeding in large part, not just by showing Birth of a Nation in the White House, but really by providing in many ways the roadmap for this cultural idea of white supremacy, and resegregating the federal government. And even in the midst of what's about to become Red Summer, using very heated rhetoric that, to say the least, doesn't help things. And the recovery really doesn't come for decades, and it comes largely as a result of the NAACP's activism and unknown heroes that I talk about, like Sadie Alexander, who also really wasn't, certainly wasn't a partisan Democrat, was a Republican actually for most of her life. But what Truman, who had been chosen as FDR's vice president because he used the N-word and showed lots of signs of being a bigot that was going to go along with Southern white supremacists, and certainly not upset that racial order. He emotionally reacts when Walter White and others tell him the stories of how black soldiers who are coming home from the war are being treated, in some cases killed, in other cases violently beaten almost to death. And they give these images in a vivid way, and it works. And that's what they're surprised by. I mean, Truman, really, this person who's appointed because of his racism, just hears how soldiers who, of course, he's identifying with as commander-in-chief after the war are being treated. But yet he doesn't know what to do. So he has that openness. He really wants to be guided. And the committee that's created by him and Walter White and others, and includes Sadie Alexander, in many ways the hero of that chapter, it's an openness to, so it is a kind of modesty combined with openness to hearing the voices of these constituencies.
Right, right. The story of William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, I think, is one of the most interesting stories to me in the book.
Mm.
They were both abolitionists, but one wanted to destroy the Constitution, whereas the other wanted to preserve it. Douglass wanted to preserve. Can you describe that for our listeners? And I guess for Douglass, he thought, despite the issues, it had the three fundamental rights that you talk about, which is equal protection, freedom to dissent, and rule of law that could apply to all. That was still worth preserving. Can you sort of unpack that for our listeners?
Sure. Thanks. The Adams presents this first crisis, and the recovery comes, as we've discussed, with Jefferson and Madison, and then the second crisis is the President Buchanan lobbies secretly the Supreme Court. He's publicly proclaiming this sort of deference to the court, that it's the court's job to tell us what the Constitution is, and I'll go along with what they say as they're considering this question of the status of Black Americans under the Constitution. And secretly, he's saying something very different. He's lobbying the court, what becomes the Dred Scott case, to say Black Americans have no status, no legal personhood even under the Constitution. Now, how do you respond to this crisis of Buchanan and the court going along with him? There are two responses. In some ways, the most natural is to say what William Lloyd Garrison says, as you said, which is, wow, this Constitution's terrible. It leads to this awful conclusion that Black Americans are not even people under the Constitution. So this is a pact with the devil, and let's get rid of it. And what's so interesting about Douglass, who I really celebrate as the true founder of American democracy, of course, he's not an 18th century founder, but he's rethinking the Constitution in the way that Americans now, I think, should look to as the true meaning of the Constitution. And he's looking at the document itself, the original Constitution. And at first, he's really a mentee of Garrison and is sort of thinking along his lines. But as he comes to study the issue, he breaks with him in a dramatic way, famously dramatic. And it's over this issue of how to read the document. And Douglass starts to say, look, the word slave doesn't appear in the Constitution. What appears are principles that are generalizable and universal. And the most important for the purposes of the book and for his arguments is the preamble to the Constitution, the first three words, we the people. And in Douglass's telling, it doesn't say we the white people. It says we the people. It pronounces the principle. And so Douglass uses that as the way in to criticize the Dred Scott case in a very different way than the Garrisonians. The Garrisonians are essentially about Dred Scott saying, yes, that's the right interpretation of the Constitution, and that's why the Constitution's evil. And what Douglass is saying is, no, it's the wrong interpretation of the Constitution, which is really rightly understood as a democratic document. And he goes so much further than that. It's not just that Black Americans have legal personhood under the Constitution. It's that there's an entitlement to, and he often uses this phrase, equal protection, the words that would become the words of the 14th Amendment. And really equal citizenship is what he means, equal political voting power. And so his arc, the arc of that recovery, partly with Lincoln, and of course I talk about the dialogues with Lincoln and how Lincoln was pretty far from Douglass's view, but at the end of his life comes pretty close to it. And it's really in the presidency of Ulysses Grant, not just the passage of the 15th Amendment, which he adamantly supports, but the enforcement acts and the prosecution by the Grant Department of Justice of more than 1,000 white terrorists throughout the United States. All of this is really Douglass's, kind of incredible. Douglass's vision from so early on in the 1850s, realized over the decades of Reconstruction.
Right. And it's really because it could have gone the other way. He could have just simply said, no, what Garrison says makes a lot of sense. And we ought to sort of burn it all down. But he says, wait a second, there's something that we could recover because the principles could be, universalized across the board, which I find, very, very fascinating. On Nixon, I think that one of your contentions in the book is that we didn't truly recover or there's a sort of we didn't get this recovery leadership
Right.
as we would typically in previous experiences where, we've seen sort of an affront to the principles, and then we'll have a leader collaborating with citizens to kind of help restore things. Can you say more about that?
That's right. And that's part of the reason why there isn't resilience in the way that I was resisting a little bit, or an inevitability, certainly, of recovery. There's hope of it. And that's the idea that we really never fully recovered from the Nixon presidency. And the story that I tell is of the potential recovery, and it still could happen. Remember, these recoveries sometimes take decades.
Take a
So when
long
I say
time.
we haven't recovered, that's not the end of the story. We might be in the midst of it right now. And, just to set this up, the crimes of Nixon, first of all, and, Watergate buffs will know this, are not just the break-in. They're so much more than that. There really were an attempt to shut down dissent. And so the ongoing investigations at the time of the pardon included the attempt to incapacitate, as he told me in an interview shortly before his death, Daniel Ellsberg, who Nixon was really obsessed with. And we know now, too, from the tapes that Nixon ordered the break-in at a safe in the Brookings Institution, which he thought had damaging information about his working secretly with the Viet Cong before the election, and was so worried about it that, Kissinger at one point on the tape says, well, Mr. President, if they shouldn't have this information, we should go to court. And he says, no, Henry, I want it done. Now, I'm quoting this word from the tape, on a thievery basis. So, it's wild stuff that he was involved in, and this was being investigated. Now, the grand jury that was looking into it, and they're fascinating to me too, because they are average citizens of Washington, D.C. Postal clerk Harold Evans, a legal secretary Elaine Edlund, and led by the head of the grand jury, the foreperson Vladimir Fragility, a researcher at the Library of Congress. They were looking into these crimes and hearing from so much of the evidence. And they make the decision. They have a straw vote. And Elund actually says in one interview, some of them with two hands raise their hands to indict the president. And Jaworski, who had been appointed in the aftermath of the Saturday Night Massacre to replace Archibald Cox, who had been fired, convinced them not to do it. And he partly said, I think a sitting president is immune. That's never been decided, but that's my view. Could be the case. And he said, wildly, if you indict him, this president's so dangerous, he might have a coup. He might surround the White House with troops to avoid arrest. Anyway, he backs them down, all with the thought that, of course, after he leaves office, there'll be an indictment then. And they do participate, I should say, in forcing that president down by handing over all the information in what's called the roadmap to Congress. And that's used in the impeachment to pressure, resulting in the pressure that led Nixon, after the vote in the House Judiciary Committee to impeach, and was never impeached by the full House, to step down. So they come back, and Kriegelich in particular is like, okay, let's indict the president. And as I tell it, that information makes its way to the White House, and soon after the pardon follows. And the pardon's clearly an attempt to stop the indictment that's looming. So the idea of the book is, look, these citizens, and Nixon very much fits the pattern, obviously famously paranoid, but also he had a philosophical idea of authoritarian constitutionalism. He said, we're in a war. It's a war between the protesters and those, the silent majority. And in a civil war, the president has emergency powers. And so when he says that when the president does it, it's not illegal, he's not, just saying that off the cuff. It's a thought out view. And he explains it actually, even in the interview with Frost, Lincoln did this and the president has emergency powers. It's talked about as if it was like a gotcha moment where he lost his patience. No, he has an authoritarian idea of the Constitution, and their idea really stands in contrast. And their idea is simple, in the same way that there's a right to dissent. The first cluster, the editors stood for, in the same way that there's an idea of equal citizenship, Douglass's idea that we talked about at length. Their idea is that a president's not above the law, full stop. I talked to two of the grand jurors who are still alive, not young people, and during COVID, actually, I spoke to them. on the phone. And, the way they talked about it was just common sense. Like, he committed a crime. Of course he should have been indicted. And that's, that's what they're about now with the immunity decision. And we have Nixon's idea of the authoritarian constitution, not fully realized, but there are elements of it that have moved us further away. And so I really, believe that part of the recovery from Nixon has to be the possibility that not only former presidents, but sitting presidents can be indicted. And that's something that, talking about bipartisan, that the Biden administration could fix right now. I mean, there is a policy of the Department of Justice that says sitting presidents can't be indicted. If he could reverse that.
Yeah. Wanted to talk a little bit about, platforms and, technology. At the time, getting messages across, folks were using pamphlets and newspapers. Presidents and citizens use them as well. We have more sophisticated technologies now, from radio to podcast to Instagram, X or
Yeah.
Twitter and Instagram and so on. In your view, what's the proper role of these technologies in conveying information, coordinating citizens' actions, and transmitting important information to strengthen democratic values? Garrison had the Liberator, Douglass had the North Star, and now we have lots and lots more. How should we be thinking about leveraging these tools and platforms?
Well, I think by analogy, sometimes there's a worry, and it's a real worry, like things are so different now. How could we look to the past? And one thing that people say is, well, media is so diffuse now, and it was so consolidated before. Now, it depends what point in history. That is true during Watergate, that many, many Americans watched the Watergate hearings. They were televised, there were 3 networks basically, and there was consolidated media then. But if you look way back, both to the editors, and then I love, just to pick up on your examples, Garrison and Douglass's papers. These were, micro constituencies, and they were polarized in the way that we're polarized now in media. So, the technology is different, of course, but in many ways, the fragmentation actually is familiar, and that can be a strength rather than a weakness, because it can allow for organization and galvanization around these themes. Now, it comes with problems too, but those problems were present then, problems of polarization and the like.
Yeah. Interesting. Now, so we the people is a powerful concept and provides checks on the system when all else fails. How do we ensure that people are continuously aware of this power and can leverage it when necessary? Sometimes I worry that, apathy is the thing that sort of does us in. And so is it via civics education of students? Is that where we can help to sort of let people know how much power and strength they have in sort of creating a check on the system?
Yeah, I think the lack of basic understanding of how the system works is one of the most important things that we need to fight against, because it's very hard to even understand how the traditional checks have failed. The argument of the book and the role of we the people in recovering the Constitution. These ideas, I think, for your listeners, are familiar. For many Americans are not, because we just have not been teaching all of this. There's a famous book about presidential rhetoric by Neustadt, and in one of the editions, I can't remember the exact number, but he wrote several editions, and he has a preface for one of the subsequent from the original. He tells the following story. He says that some of the Nixon staffers were assigned the book, which is about how basically a president can use the bully pulpit to galvanize power. And it was assigned reading. And so the staffer says to him, you're responsible too for what happened, meaning, like, you wrote a book about power and we took it seriously. And he's taken aback by this, because he says, look, when I was, in school, we read Corwin and had this massive civic education at an early age. And of course, all of my recommendations about presidential power are meant to be within the bounds of the rule of law and the Constitution. So, his point is, like, a lot of the sort of assumption that civic education is always there and this is obviously, in the early 70s, he's talking about, had disappeared already by then. And I think things have gotten worse, not better. So it's very hard for me to make even the arguments, to talk about the arguments that you and I are talking about without civic education. I have written a previous book, and I'll say a little bit more about how they compare, called The Oath in the Office. And the subtitle is A Guide to the Constitution for Future Presidents. And the idea of the book is this is everything about the Constitution that you need to know if you want to be president of the United States. It's written in the second person. But as much as being written for presidents, it's written for citizens to understand what these checks are, how they're supposed to operate, how to think about the document. But part of what this book is about is that those traditional checks, as important as they are and as much as we should bring them back, historically haven't always worked. And we've got to sort of rethink the checks in a real way with actual examples throughout American history. And the thing that has worked in the absence of these checks are American citizens sort of demanding or reclamation of these core values that you and I keep talking about: the right to dissent, equal citizenship, and the rule of law.
Thank you. Given that the judiciary is often seen as a safeguard against executive overreach, how do you see its role evolving? Can it remain an impartial check, or is that, it's also one of these institutions that, sort of have to keep an eye on and make sure that they're doing the right thing?
Yeah, it can't just be that we trust the court and whatever it says is the meaning of the Constitution. There is an unfortunate bipartisan view that seems to say that, this kind of Marbury versus Madison view, and that says the Constitution, judges interpret the law, the Constitution's the law, sometimes called the Marbury syllogism. And so judges have the right to interpret the Constitution. But we know from American history that they often, very often, especially in moments of crisis, just get it really wrong. So let's go back, in the Sedition Act. Samuel Chase lobbies for the Sedition Act, and he goes and sits at trial level to make sure that these editors are convicted. And when they try to raise the free speech claims, he's like, just doesn't allow it. So the idea that the Supreme Court is going to, in the sort of, way that we intuitively think the court's supposed to operate, strike down the Sedition Act as unconstitutional violation of free speech, like, no way. They are doing the extreme opposite. Take the second example, Dred Scott. Did the Supreme Court come along and tell President Buchanan, equal citizenship is required? And of course, there's standing for Dred Scott in this case, in his pursuit of his freedom. No, the court decides the case in conjunction with the president, with Buchanan, that says no rights at all for Black Americans. These are two of the most vicious assaults on democracy, not just by presidents, but with courts working alongside them.
And I'd say that Korematsu versus the U.S. is another sort of major one, which fostered the internment of Japanese Americans and so on.
Absolutely. Korematsu, the idea that America rounded up people based on race and ethnicity, and then the court not just upholds it, but lies, saying that this is somehow a security concern, even though they knew at the time there was no security concern about these families that were being rounded up.
Yeah.
The court just has a long history of getting it really wrong. And even in the best cases, there are counterexamples. U.S. versus Nixon is a classic one. If you look closely, they leave lots of room for the idea of immunity from prosecution, which we now see. And that room has made a big difference. Or even Brown. Part of the story and people might find this part of the book surprising, but part of the story that I want to tell is, look, Brown, of course, was an important case, and reversing Plessy versus Ferguson had a lot of symbolic and other value. But in terms of what worked in desegregating America, it was Sadie Alexander's insistence in the Truman Commission report that financial incentives be used to persuade, and then some, public schools throughout America to desegregate. And the idea was that if you don't desegregate, you're going to lose federal funds. And they're providing the funds on the one hand, but also not going to remove them if there's not desegregation. That's the idea of a citizen, of an economist. And as important as Brown is in reversing the legal regime of Plessy versus Ferguson and the end of Reconstruction, it is the citizen action more so actually in this case than a court that makes a difference. So yeah, it's not going to be the courts, and it can't be. It's part of the civic education point, I think, that we can't just let citizens defer to courts or think that reading opinions is how you figure out the meaning of the document. You have to think for yourselves and think about the principles and the values. That's the Douglass legacy too. Think about it the way he did.
Yeah. Speaking of courts, the story about Chase being impeached is one of the most fascinating stories in the book. I guess the only judge who was impeached. I guess it was attempted, but it didn't actually succeed.
But it chastises them, and impeachment sometimes works that way. Even though it doesn't succeed, there's a reaction. And Chase was he's often described as partisan, and I think that doesn't quite capture it. Of course, he was a partisan Federalist, but if that's all he was, it wouldn't be in a book about threats to democracy. It's so much beyond that. It's that he really worked with Adams to shut down the existence of the opposition party. I mean, partisans suggest that there are two parties, so multiple parties, and they're battling it out. That's not what he was doing. They were working to eliminate the other party. And so the impeachment, I think, as much as people might say it's Jefferson's retaliation or something, no, it was essential to send the message like judges shouldn't be playing that role. But of course, there are also pardons of all the people convicted under the Sedition Act. That's also important, in addition to the refusal to bring it back.
Yeah. As we wrap up the conversation, I wanted to get your sense of what you think is the call to action from your book. Like if folks read the book, what do you want them to sort of rally around, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm often asked, like, who are the people that are going to do this in the future? The idea of the book certainly is that if we're going to recover from what I think is the current crisis of democracy, it's not going to be done by courts and not just by politicians, although a subsequent president might do it. It has to be at the behest of citizens. And yet I'm reluctant to say, here are the 10 people. It should be Ben and Corey and 8 others. It's, it's really up to us it's a call to action, and it's up to us to be or find these people and organize and demand it. And certainly one thing that I haven't been shy about speaking out is the Boston Globe said this isn't so much history as prognostication. It's future predicting history, because it came out the day after the immunity case. And the idea that not just a sitting president, but a former president is immune from prosecution. To my mind, you'll see this in the book, that's one of the things I think that characterized the Nixon era that we have not yet recovered from and need to.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Corey, thank you so much for joining us. For listeners, the book is The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. Really good book. Thank you for doing this.
Thanks so much, Ben, and thanks for reading it so closely. I do a lot of interviews, and I really appreciate the details that you brought to this discussion. So thanks so much.
Sure thing.